Good morning and welcome today to worship. I would like to thank Dustin for talking to us about being scared of the dark. And as we will hear just in a little bit in the sermon, the disciples were also scared at one point or several points really. And so to begin, I will start with a story. A few years ago, when I was doing my ministry inquiry program, which is kind of like a practicum, pastoral practicum in rural Iowa, I was asked to teach the grade sixes during the vacation Bible school that summer. The curriculum was very straightforward with all the right answers and ways of teaching kids the Bible stories that connected with the theme. It was pretty easy to teach the lessons, and all the materials were already prepared for the teachers. So all we had to do was be present, read from the script, and lay out the decorations and hand out the worksheets. One of the days focused on the story of Matthew 14:22-33. It is the story of when Jesus was walking on water while the disciples were on a boat in the middle of the sea, which reads as follows. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get onto the boat and go ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far away from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking towards them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out of fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on water and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they got onto the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The kids in my VBS class listened to me read the story while sitting in the circle on the floor in the church basement. In the middle of the circle, there was a pile of tissue paper crumbled up. They were all different tones of blue and kind of simulated the ocean and the waves. All the kids stared at the blue center of the circle while I told the story. When I was done reading, I asked them what they thought about the story and the characters in it. There were several voices that pointed out the amazingness of Jesus walking on water and how cool that must have been. Then I asked them what they thought about the disciples. And their responses were almost unanimously pointing out that Peter shouldn't have doubted and pretty much wasted a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to walk on water. How dumb was he, right? Why would he doubt? Why would he question Jesus' power? Sometimes reading the Bible can feel easy and simple, particularly the stories that we know by heart, like this one. It is easy to assume that the point is to show off Jesus' miraculous powers and assert that he is truly the Son of God. However, often these easy and simple assumptions about the text blind us from a deeper meaning to the story. Also, they can oversimplify the message the author may have originally tried to convey. For example, is it a dumb thing to doubt? Is it a bad thing to be afraid? Was Jesus actually disappointed at Peter when he said, "You of little faith, Why do you doubt? After listening to their first impressions and responses to the story, I told my VVS kids to stare back at the blue paper ocean at the center of the circle. I invited them to imagine themselves on the boat. It has been a long day. You are tired. Your teacher, the person you trust the most, isn't with you. The wind is against you and the waves have pushed you far away from shore. You have spent the night sleeping on the boat. So let's assume it hasn't been the most restful night of your life. And it was a bit cold because it was windy and you were in the middle of the sea. You have just woken up and probably don't have your eyes fully open yet, and your awareness isn't very sharp because you have had no coffee and nothing to eat. All of a sudden, you see this person walking towards the boat. Each step gets them closer to you. You don't get scared easily, but then it hits you. We're in the middle of the sea. No one can just walk out here. You look around and then you remember the person you trust the most, Jesus, isn't with you on the boat. Who do you go for help? How do you explain it? What do you do? Where do you run to? Wouldn't you be scared too? Well, after explaining things that way to them, the kids did seem to have a bit of a different perspective on the story. I went on and said, have you ever ridden on a roller coaster? I have. It's so thrilling. I've been in Orlando at Disney World and Universal Studios and have ridden all the crazy and scary rides. The worst one was the Tower of Terror. It is like an elevator where they lift you all the way into this tower and then they drop you almost all the way to the bottom. Your stomach feels like shreds. You scream like a little baby. It is the scariest thing, especially if you're a person that is afraid of heights, like I am. While you wait on to get onto that ride in those long lines in the heat, you know it will be scary. And you know that it is safe, or at least that it is very unlikely that it will break while you're on it. But that does not keep you from screaming in shock when you're on the actual ride being dropped from over 60 meters high at 15 times the normal speed of an elevator. I can imagine Peter feeling a similar thrill while he was walking on water. He asks Jesus if he can do it, knowing that it is likely a safe thing to do. Jesus is doing it. However, as the adrenaline rushes and he continues to walk further away from the boat, the fear and shock creep in. Peter, perhaps for a second, doubts if it is actually all good and well. For a moment, the emotions of the moment take over, and he's scared. Fear takes over, because this is such an unthinkable thing, such an exhilarating feeling. And he screams like a baby. That day, during BVS, we learned to empathize with the disciples and not to judge Peter too harshly for being overtaken by his emotions while walking on water with Jesus, which I can only think of as the first century equivalent of riding on a roller coaster. This story of Jesus walking on water is also told in the Gospels of Mark and John, while not present in the Gospel of Luke. However, there are clear differences between the stories. John seems to focus only on the miraculous act, while Mark points out the disciples' hardened hearts and their lack of understanding. And even more different than the rest is Matthew's account, who is the only one to mention Peter taking a step out of the boat. Richard B. Gardner writes in his Matthew commentary that it is in Peter's adventure that the depiction of the church in the story reaches its climax. And Christian teachers in every era have sought to define the lesson of faith that Peter illustrates. He explains further that at one level, the story of Peter is a story of failure, with a stern rebuke for insufficient faith. And that it is precisely in failure that Peter's learn, as we must learn, the kind of faith that rivets in its attention solely on the words of Jesus. He finishes off by stating that such is the faith that Matthew commends his readers. Although I do not like arguing with respected commentary writers, I think that Gardner simplifies the message of Matthew's account of the story too much and does not allow for a deeper meaning to arise. Condemning Peter for his lack of faith is not the most sensitive move, especially if you've taken the time to empathize with Peter and the rest of the disciples by picturing yourself screaming like a baby on a roller coaster. The late writer and theologian Rachel Held Evans explains that in Scripture, the sea represents chaos. It's churning, unpredictable waters teeming with monsters and demons threatening death. So when Jesus walks on its waves, it's not just showing off. He is making a statement about God, the God who reigns over even the most visceral, primal fears. The God who, in the words of the psalmist, makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters. Take courage, Jesus tells the disciples as he walks across the sea. It is I. Do not be afraid. The best translation for it is I from the Greek is I am, a clear reference to the God of Abraham and Isaac, Moses and Miriam. Evans seems to disagree with Gardner by stating that the miracles of Jesus aren't just magic tricks designed to awe prospective converts, nor are they tests from the past meant to sort out the true believers from the doubters. She asserts that instead they are instructions, challenges. They show us what to do and how to hope. She explains further that the miracles of Jesus prefigure a future in which there is no more suffering, no more death, no more stigmatization, no more exclusion, no more chaos. They show us what it looks like for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And they invite us to buy into that future now with every act of compassion and inclusion, every step towards healing and reconciliation and love. I tend to agree more with Evans. I see the miracle stories as an invitation to hope for heaven today, to imagine the unimaginable and hope for the unthinkable and unexpected. And when we can't do that, when we doubt, when we are overwhelmed by the reality of the situation, and all of a sudden we see ourselves sinking, all we need to do is remind ourselves that Jesus is there to take our hand and pull us out of the water safe onto the boat. Perhaps it is easy to say and far more difficult to trust and hope. I find myself thinking that often. Last week, Marla led our staff devotional during our weekly meeting. She shared about how she had listened to a series of webinars her sister had sent her about resiliency just recently. I was curious, so I asked her to share them with me. In these webinars led by Rachel Thimbalt, the presenter explores different aspects of building up resiliency in oneself. One of the highlighted strategies to build up this resilience is meditation and a mystical faith. That is to say, not a dogmatic faith. This is an important differentiation because building up resilience is, in part, the ability to trust that whatever hard situation we're going through will come to an end. The ability to envision a different reality than the one we are currently living in. A better reality plays a big part in our resilience. It is about cultivating faith entrenched in mystery and centering prayer, not just rules and regulations. Resilience is not about focusing on failures. Quite the opposite. It's about hoping for a better outcome next time when we try something. Resilience is also about taking risks. It is built on challenges, deriving satisfaction from cultivating our talents and using our talents to give back. I see Peter as an example of a resilient person. Even though he experienced a scary event and later a traumatic experience when his teacher was tortured and sacrificed, he took on the challenge. He cultivated his faith with a few ups and downs and gave back with his life to the church. I do not agree with Gardner that Peter walking on water is a story of failure. Instead, I choose to see it as an example of how to build resilience, taking on challenges and trusting that Jesus is nearby if anything goes wrong. Temple closed one of her sessions with the following quote, which I found fitting. Resilient people know they have to let go of the past and choose to reinvent themselves and the world around them. The better way to reinvent is collectively and building up a world more respectful of life in all of its forms. May we allow God to guide our steps as we reinvent ourselves and the world around us into God's heavenly kingdom. Amen.